This is my 2016 Yamaha R1 that I got for about 25% off.
It was cheap because it had spent the last 2 years of its life getting abused on track as a race bike. But it's only done 9,000 kilometers and came with the road kit, so I've been turning it back into a street bike. Because who doesn't want a cheap R1?
But as time has gone on, I've started to wonder if that was the only reason it was cheap.
Because when I had it out on track, it did this. Mildly worrying. And although it came with the road kit, there were 3 broken parts in the headlights assembly that cost me $400 to fix. The fairings aren't OEM and have missing pieces. But I'm not giving up on it, because this generation R1 has been my dream bike since my dad got the anniversary edition 6 years ago.
And because it's ultimately his fault that I even wanted an R1 in the first place, I made him help me work on it, where I think we found the reason the bike kept cutting out on track, and it's not pretty. Unlike 6 years ago when my dad had his R1, he no longer lives in the same country as I do. However, last month my entire family flew out to visit, so I made sure to put him to work on the R1, which is why it looks even more naked than the last time you saw it. Let me get you up to speed quickly.
First, I wanted to fill the cooling system since I drained it in the last video to clean the radiator. But not before cleaning out the coolant reservoir with some radiator cleaner and hot water, because you might remember in track trim there was just a Motul bottle cable tied up here acting as a coolant reservoir. We found some bolts that would do the job of mounting it to the radiator and made the severed hoses work before filling it up. Despite my dad knowing more about bikes than I do, I made sure to be close by just in case he had any questions. The R1 also has an air bleed screw on the top of the water pump that we made sure to bleed, which meant we could start it up and let my dad hear it for the first time. His yellow R1 had a stock exhaust, so I made sure to remind him that mine sounds better. And I also got to see that the headlights I installed in the last video do actually work. Then we could turn our attention to the wheels.
So I've changed my mind about getting the wheels powder coated. I'm gonna get them painted instead, because I've heard horror stories about powder coating magnesium. Some say that the heat of baking on the powder makes magnesium brittle, and others say that magnesium releases a gas that then ruins the finish. Either way, I don't want to take the risk, and paint will work just as well.
But for that, the wheels needed to be stripped of tires, brake discs, bearings and sensor rings. I planned on doing everything except the tires and bearings myself, but there was a bit of miscommunication at the bike shop and they stripped everything for me and proceeded to charge me a fortune, and still missed a bearing because they didn't have the special tool needed to remove this ring which holds the bearing hostage. So after another trip to Yamaha, who did have the correct tool, I tapped this last bearing out myself by hitting the inner race with a socket, and luckily it was very easy. So all that was left was the rim tape, which I was dreading because the last time I removed rim tape, it came off in tiny pieces and took hours. So I was relieved that the bike gods were on my side for this one. Then, since the wheels are getting painted now, I may as well get the tank done at the same time, because the tank cover it had on it destroyed the finish. Getting it off is a quick 3 bolts, 3 hoses and 1 connector. And then came the fun part of removing the fuel pump and draining the fuel, which was a lot easier as a 2-man job. I should hire my dad more often. Finally, we removed the fuel cap, which was missing the hidden bolt under the cap, possibly due to weight reduction, but most likely due to a mechanic missing brain cells. And this was where the fun really began and everything started to make sense. The road kit the bike came with was that horrible Rossi kit, so they clearly got the tank painted to match. But I think the painter paid the owner to paint the tank rather than the other way around, because I've never seen such a bad job. You can see it all flaking, wrinkling and chipping, revealing the red paint underneath. The cheap paint couldn't withstand being exposed to paint fumes, and a lot of that paint inevitably made its way into the tank.
When the bike was cutting out at the track, I asked the guy that owns the race shop there and actually races an R1 what he thought it could be, and he said the fuel pump might be clogged. So this was our chance to open it up and have a look, and boy was he right.
This is how the strainer on the fuel pump looks. It's just about completely covered in flakes of paint. No wonder the poor bike couldn't get enough fuel and kept cutting out. But somehow that wasn't even the last problem with the tank. It also had a stripped bolt that someone had the bright idea of simply using silicone to hold down the bolt rather than fixing it. So I drilled it out and installed a threaded insert instead so we could use the stock-sized bolt. It also wasn't without hiccups. But once it's been resprayed, it should look relatively tidy.
And that brings you up to speed. Unfortunately, my apprentice has since flown home again, so I'm all on my own. So the R1 has just been wasting away in the corner here for the last few weeks. I took 2 weeks off while my family were here, since I only see them once or twice a year. Our kitten got sick, which cost a fortune and delayed paint. Paint itself took 2 weeks, and then I had other projects I needed to film and sponsor obligations. But excuses out of the way, the wheels and tank are finally back from paint.
I told you I wanted a lighter color to see the shape of the wheels better, and a few people already guessed it, but in the end I went with silver. More specifically, the wheels are satin silver and the tank is gloss silver.
It's supposed to look like an aluminium finish, like the tank on an R1M. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I don't like silver, especially on wheels, but it should all come together with the fairings. Just trust the process, okay?
It's just about impossible to work on the bike in the corner here, so I wanted to put the wheels back on so I could move it to a more suitable spot. But as you can see, the axle, blocks and spacers all needed a good clean first. I tried to use a tub to catch the dirt, but making a mess was still inevitable. A track bike has a lot more tire changes in its life than a street bike, and you can see the wear and tear from it around the chain adjuster region. But I'm not sure if I want to get the swing arm powder coated or not. I treated myself to a new tub of grease, so everything got a fresh coat before going back together. To be honest, I didn't like the look of the wheels on their own, but once on the bike, they started to grow on me. And this was the perfect opportunity to replace those drilled brake caliper bolts. The other day I removed one clip-on for a different video and found a ton of dirt underneath the triple clamp and didn't want to put it back together without cleaning it. It made moving the bike around with just one handlebar a tad tricky, but I think it was worth it.
In the last couple of weeks, I've changed the oil and oil filter on this bike. We've also changed the coolant. So the one thing I want to do before we put the tank back on, because it makes sense, is check the air filter.
I know it really annoys people when I use an impact on airbox screws, which is probably why I do it. But an airbox just has so many screws, and if you're careful, it doesn't matter at all. I was excited to find a DNA race filter because race filters are washable, unlike stock filters, and it wasn't very dirty. So I just blew it out and threw it back in. Now back to our tank troubles. By the way, this is how the threaded insert looks after paint, practically factory. But I did have to use an old bolt just to get some of the paint out of the threads quickly, and I used some fuel to rinse out the inside of the tank, just in case there were any paint flakes still in there, but I mostly just made a mess.
So this is our fuel pump, and its current fuel strainer is completely caked in paint flakes, stopping the fuel from getting through it. And this is its replacement. And if this fixes all our problems, it's literally a $6 fix.
I still can't get over the strainer, and there are even bigger paint flakes in the bottom of the fuel pump assembly. I just hope none of this has made its way to the injectors. I disassembled the pump even further and blew out all the passages before the old strainer simply pops off and the new one slots on. And luckily I took photos of how the wiring goes because I would never have figured it out otherwise. With the fuel pump back in, I dislodged all the silicone from that fuel cap bolt hole. It was a tough choice between fastening the cap down with silicone or bolts, but in the end I opted for the boring option, and to my relief, it finally sits flush and looks OEM. As soon as the tank was back on the bike, I wiped it down with alcohol and made sure to put a tank protector on it to protect it from me. And it looked 100 times better than before.
The time has finally come to deal with these UFO-looking frame sliders that quite frankly look awful.
I assume the goal is to increase the surface area and reduce the chance of the bike flipping over, but who knows.
I figured I had about 3 options when it comes to these frame sliders. I could keep them, which I don't want to do. I could get the replacement engine mounting bolts for these, but that would probably cost around the same price as just getting different frame sliders for the bike. There's also a part of me that feels superstitious about removing frame sliders altogether from a bike that has previously had them. I just feel like you're 10 times more likely to drop it if you remove them and it did previously have them.
I ended up with some GB Racing frame sliders. They come with a bolt, the mounting bracket, the slider itself, and a bolt to fasten the slider to the mount. The install is as straightforward as it gets. Remove the UFO, put the new bolt in through the mounting bracket thing, slip the slider on, and put the bolt in. Then repeat on the other side. They don't look the best either, but they are relatively subtle.
So this silencer has been bothering me since I got the bike. It is an SC project, it's an CRT, it's laser etched down the bottom here, and it looks beautiful. I've always wanted an SC project, so it really bothers me that it has this red vinyl sticker on here and not the correct logo. So I ordered a replacement badge from SC Project's website.
Since it was a cold day, I used some heat to remove the red vinyl and some rubbing alcohol to get rid of the leftover adhesive. I thought I ordered a heavy-duty heat-resistant decal, but this thin, flimsy-looking sticker showed up, which concerned me. It did, however, have a sort of foil backing though, so I really hope it can withstand the heat because I think it looks so much cooler like this. Now the only thing left to do was take it outside to see what that fresh paint looks like in the sun. But obviously the battery was dead again because it's been sitting for so long. Nevertheless, indoors, I'm really not a silver fan, but I think the tank and wheels complement the silver engine cases quite nicely. But you'll have to wait and see what the final plan for the bike is, although it might be controversial. So the fuel filter is no longer clogged, and hopefully we've addressed the problem by painting the tank. Plus, it no longer has wrinkles and scratches. The fuel cap now sits flush with no stripped bolt holes. The wheels are now more noticeable with all new wheel bearings. It has fresh coolant, a cleaner air filter, new frame sliders, and an official SC project.
So basically all that's left to do is button up some loose ends and install some fairings. But that's the bad news I have for you. I don't know when the fairings are going to arrive. They are on their way, but it could be 3 weeks or it could be 3 months. I am itching to ride this bike, but you guys are going to have to be patient with me. We've had some logistical issues. I will explain more when they do finally arrive, but if you want to be the first to know when I get my hands on them, follow me on Instagram. But anyway, let me know what color you think is going to go best with the silver, and I'll see you on the next ride.